All right. I have been told that we are live. So hello, everybody, and welcome to our chat slash web seminar with Elliott Morris on the topic of the upcoming American midterm elections, which are only 7 months away. So it feels like a million years and also like they're tomorrow. My name is Hannah Tyler. I'm the Program Officer for Foreign and Security Policies here at the Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung DC, and I will also be your moderator today. Elliott and I are both coming to you live from DC, but we also know there is a large international audience watching us and our upcoming midterms with interest. I'm going to go through a quick run of show, some housekeeping notes, introduce Elliott, and then we'll get into the discussion. So for run of show, Elliott is going to start with a quick presentation slash rundown of the publication he wrote for us, which we published in February. So we're all starting from the same baseline. For those who haven't read Elliott's publication yet, it's on our website, and the link, I think, should be pinned in the chat. Then Elliott and I will have a moderated discussion, which will last about 30 minutes, and then we'll dedicate the last 20-ish minutes of the event to audience Q&A. If you have any questions for Elliott, please leave them in the live comment section on YouTube. We'll bundle those questions and I'll pose them to Elliott in the last 15 or 20 minutes of the discussion. Feel free to type your questions in English or in German. If you ask a question in German, we will translate it. Elliott, don't worry. With that, I will introduce our guest of honor, Elliott. Elliott is a data-driven journalist and author living in Washington, D.C. He writes the best-selling Substack newsletter Strength in Numbers and helps run the polling aggregation and election prediction website 50plus1.news. He was formerly the editorial director of data analytics at ABC News, where he developed polling aggregation and election forecasting models and managed the research and data visualization teams for ABC's data journalism website 538. With all of that out of the way, I will hand it over to Elliott, who will give us a review of his paper, which provides a data-driven forecast of the 2026 midterms in the US. Over to you.
Well, thank you for the generous introduction and for having me. And hello to everyone watching. I'm going to talk for, I think, 3 or 4 minutes. Been told definitely don't do more than 10 by Hada. So here's, I think, 5 points on the 2026 midterms. 3 of these are kind of table stakes environmental factors and historical predictions. And then there's 2 potential wild cards I see at play right now. The first and most important factor is Donald Trump's vanishing Republican coalition. Trump's 2024 gains among Latinos and young voters and independents have all but evaporated in both the polling data and in electoral data. So Donald Trump's approval right now is 37 percentage points, which is about 13 points below his 2024 vote share, which is a pretty enormous swing in terms of public opinion moving over 2 years in America. It's a large difference. But worse, those defections are concentrated among exactly the group credited with his 2024 victories. So 25% of Black and Hispanic voters, for example, that voted for Trump now say they disapprove of his job as president. In some more recent polling, updating this report a little bit live for you, about 15% of Trump's 2024 voters say they would back Democrats or not vote at all in the 2024 midterms. If you back out that math, it means he would have only won about 42% of the vote. And it's not just polling. The elections last year in Virginia and New Jersey confirmed this, with every demographic group moving to the left. So that is a pretty daunting hill to climb right off the bat. Worst, though, the affordability crisis in America is reflecting poorly on Trump's presidency, with about 64% of voters or adults in America telling us that Trump's not spending enough time lowering grocery prices and other prices. And about 70% say he's too focused on deportations. So the big reason he won in 2024 is now his worst drawback, essentially. If we don't care about any of that and we just want to think about this from a historical perspective, that picture is also very bad for the president. On average, a president loses about 26 seats in the House, but Trump can only afford, or the Republicans can only currently afford to lose three. At a 37% approval rating, presidents typically lose about 37 seats. There's been no election since 2002, the post 9/11 election, when a president gained seats in the House. So we can be pretty sure he will lose it. Two complicating factors. First is redistricting. Republicans around the country have asked or been asked by Donald Trump to add seats for the Republican Party. They've done that, but they've gained about 9 seats. But Democrats have fought back in California, in Virginia, where a ballot referendum will be voted on next month, where I live right now, and in Utah, where a court decision helped Democrats. And Democrats may even come out ahead in redistricting. We'll see. And of course, the House is not the only chamber having elections right now. The Senate will also have elections. Democrats need to flip 4 seats there. They might do that in North Carolina, Maine, Alaska, and Ohio, with Iowa and Texas looking like a harder sell for them. So that is, I think, setting the stage here as of March. And there are few factors that could change this prediction in my mind, but we can fiddle around the edges in the discussion to see what the landscape reveals about the contest. Over to you, Hannah.
Awesome. That was, I think, basically 5 minutes on the dot. So why don't we start in on our discussion? First question, we've obviously had a couple of primaries now. I think the most watched probably in Texas and Illinois. So how have these first few primaries of the year changed the picture or the outlook that you just presented and in your analysis, if at all? Are there any particularly surprising results, or are there results that we saw that went against polling assumptions in as much as there are polling assumptions about primaries?
Yeah, primaries are great news events, but unfortunately are not super predictive for the midterms. And that's just because they tend to be heavily dependent on who is running in these primaries and how much momentum and energy there is in the press for certain primaries. That being said, like I don't want the audience to read too much into them, but that being said, Democrats are voting at a much higher rate in their primaries. In Texas, for example, Democrats cast more ballots than Republicans in a state Trump won by 14 percentage points or so. So that is notable, and they did the same thing in North Carolina, where Democrats are hoping to pick up that Senate seat. So if I'm really squinting there, then there's some confirmation of the trends we're seeing in the other data that Democrats are really engaged, but I wouldn't necessarily use the primaries to predict the outcome.
And the fact that Democrats cast more ballots in Texas and North Carolina is atypical, I would assume.
That's right. The last time this happened was 2008 in the Democratic primary in Texas. Is the Democratic primary for president. However, to the point about uncertainty, John McCain still won Texas by 15 percentage points.
So not necessarily indicative. Good to
Right.
know. Let's go back to, you talked a little bit in your intro about this number. 15% of Trump voters from the last election say they would vote for a Democrat, not vote at all. You've also done a couple of stories about how Trump voters feel about him now. It's something you talked about in the paper. This question of how many of the voters that crossed over to Trump in 2024, he and the Republican Party can maintain or sort of keep in their column. Can you tell us a little bit more about this dynamic, delve a little bit more deeply into sort of which of the demographic groups have shifted the most strongly against him? And are there any groups that have shown surprising dedication to him or have stuck by him, are really like locked in?
This is great. About 1 in 6 Trump voters disapprove of him, which is a pretty staggering number for your own coalition. And this speaks to what I have characterized as more of a borrowing of these voters in 2024 rather than a winning or a converting of them. There was a lot of hand wringing, well, really more like victory lapping in the American press among Republican writers after 2024, characterizing Trump's victory as a big realignment. But we see now, with the benefit of hindsight, and potentially at the time with the little benefit of humility, that this was an overreaction to the data. Um, and I say that because Donald Trump's disapproval is higher among those groups that swung most to him. Black voters, for example, traditionally a Democratic group, only 65% of Black Trump voters approve of how he's handling his job as president. Hispanic voters and young voters is about 75 or 80%. And on the topic of affordability, the Americans that make less than $50,000 a year as a household, which is about about 60% of household median income here, so lower income. Those Trump voters also only about 3 out of every 4 still like what Trump is doing. Um, that doesn't necessarily translate to large Democratic victories. A lot of these voters will still be Republican first, even if they don't like what Trump is doing. But Democrats are posting a large advantage on midterm polling for the House. I wouldn't be surprised if they win by 8 or 9 percentage points at this point in the cycle. And it could be even more depending on backlash to the war in Iran. And I don't think we have a full picture on how that impacts this report quite yet. Um, there are, of course, groups that will be, ride or die Republican, just like there are groups that are ride or die Democrats, or in this case, we might call them MAGA Americans. Uh, so Trump's approval rating hasn't really faltered at all among white evangelical Christians, for example, senior Trump voters or high income Trump voters who might not be feeling the impacts of affordability.
What about rural voters? You've written a little bit about rural voters as well.
Yeah, rural voters are hard for us to poll. So there
Mm,
are some caveats here. But in looking at the election results, they seem very uh, deflated. So there's
mm,
obviously in rural America uh, a higher focus on affordability. That's where I'm from, is rural Texas, for context.
hmm.
Um, and these voters are also not very politically engaged, at least not as much as Democrats in big cities. And we saw in the Virginia election last year that rural precincts turned out at about 70% the rate of Democratic precincts. Um, Rural communities have also been hit, zooming out of Virginia, looking now at Iowa, for example, have been hit hard by tariffs and some of the agricultural policy of the administration. The
Mm.
inability to sell soybeans to China, for example, has been a big problem in the Plains states. And deportation of American farm labor by undocumented immigrants has also been so bad that the administration has stopped pursuing deportations on farms, which yielded some pretty troubling viral clips last summer, for example. Um, Rural Americans are Republican leaning, but they have been bit by Republican leadership in the past. And this could be a point where Democrats can start reaching out to this community again, saying, we are here for you. This is an opening for them that they didn't
Mm.
necessarily have in the past.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I think this is actually a good segue to talk about what you think are the main problems or weak spots that you see both Democrats and Republicans facing in the midterms. We talked obviously a little bit about this persistent problem of rural voters, but what do you think are sort of the main things that both parties are going to be facing down going into these midterms specifically?
The but both parties face a perceptions problem right now, each of their own. Uh, they varied slightly across the party. So Republicans obviously face the party that they are Donald Trump's party, the party that has put in power a very unpopular, damaging president. Republicans also are viewed as more extreme in my polling than the Democrats are viewed. They're viewed as less compassionate as well, less empathetic, and less competent in government. All of those problems have been reinforced to some extent by mass deportations policy, by an inability of Republican Congress people to enforce their Article 1, their constitutional obligation of oversight, for example, of ICE. Uh, but it's not all that doesn't necessarily mean it's all roses for the Democrats, right? When we do polling and we ask Americans how they feel about the Democrats, voters will say they feel the party is weak, that it doesn't stand for anything. They do say it's extreme at lesser rate than they say the Republicans are extreme, but still about 40% of Americans say they view the Democrats as extreme. And one thing you don't want to be in America is viewed as extreme, at least for your electoral performance. Um, there's there's another problem with the party as well, in that it, at least in the Senate, is defending. So this is more electorally than perceptions based, but it's defending, or it needs to win seats that are very Republican leaning. So if it has any chance of a durable Senate majority, it needs to win places like Texas and Florida, which Florida, for example, seems almost impossible for them at this point. If they win Ohio and Iowa, they will have won seats that Donald Trump won by double digits, which is something of a coup. That's very successful. The question is whether or not they can do that outside of an environment where the Republicans have all these disadvantages. The biggest problem for the party, though, is that it doesn't have a leader. No one can think of, when you think of a Democrat in your head, there's nothing you think of in particular which means Republican criticism of the party as being far left, extremist, ineffective can really stick when you don't have a real positive contrast to that image.
Are you doing any polling? Because we obviously get this question all the time, right? Who's running in 2028? Who is the leader of the Democrats? And there's been sort of like polling that we've seen, like I saw a poll yesterday that Newsom is further ahead than Harris, for example. Are you doing any polling around sort of like leadership of the Democratic Party? Who comes out on top? A lot of this obviously is sort of like moot because so much can change in two and a
Right.
half years, but is there anyone that sort of like really stands out to you right now, at
That's
least?
my line. When you say things could change, don't pay too much attention to it. That's
Sorry.
my, you scooped me. Yes, to an extent, I wouldn't pay attention to, like, I wouldn't use those polls to forecast the election. They are interesting in the sense that they are agenda setting devices. What I mean by that is pollsters, when they ask, who do you think will win the, or who do you want to vote for in the Democratic primary in 2028? They are putting popular sort of conventional wisdom about potential party leaders into the survey. And so figures like Gavin Newsom, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rising to the top there is partly a function of who we all believe to be the party leader today,
Hmm.
or potential party leaders. Uh, None of these figures, I think, would really fix the party's perception problems. Either Democrats nominate a figure like Gavin Newsom, just in the case of this survey, who is affiliated with more of the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. Obviously, he's a legislator from California. That comes with risks of being called extremist. And he hasn't exactly handled the affordability crisis there
Mm,
well. Democrats are not building as much
fair.
housing in California that they need to build. So that comes with risks. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez also comes with risk of being called an extremist from her former or current Democratic Socialist label. I'm unsure what she calls herself these days. But either way, there's the perception problem there. Um, but she also comes with some advantages. Her part of the party represents a sort of anti-system component of American political ideology that is incredibly potent. It's the reason Donald Trump won in 2016. It's the reason he won in 2024. And if Democrats can think about how to capture that in a figure like AOC or someone else, there could be some hidden advantages that aren't immediately obvious to us when we think about politics in terms of left versus right.
Can we talk about, you have done a little bit of writing about this sort of anti-system axis and the rise of these anti-system voters, so voters with anti-system attitudes that don't align along this traditional sort of left-right axis. We also as you have discussed, and we all know, Republicans and Democrats historically unpopular, both dealing with perception problems. Gallup said at the beginning of the year, 45% of US adults identify as political independents, which is a new high. So what does all of this mean, this unpopularity of both parties, the rise of this anti-system voter that's propelled Trump into the White House twice? What does this mean for the future of the parties? And how are these anti-system voters going to influence the midterms 2028 beyond? How should Democrats maybe be trying to build this anti-system thinking into their strategy, and how should they be thinking about how to persuade these voters?
Yeah. I mean, the thing that people should take away is that the voters who are anti-party, anti-system, and anti-system here can be political and or economic. Um, they are not wedded to Trump. In fact, they're very skeptical now of Trump the more he wields power and the more he breaks some of his promises about lower prices and wars, for example, and does things in office that are viewed as corrupt. So things like the pardon of January 6 rioters, even those convicted of violent crimes, and Trump's friendliness with crypto are often cited in online discussions as evidence that he is now more a product of the system than something that could correct it. Um, and this anti-system ideology, gosh, I really should have a whiteboard here. But if you imagine people as sitting somewhere on the left or the right, if you
Mm-hmm.
then place them up and down based on their anti-systemness, they are all over the place. They're
Okay.
both left and they're both right. So the party that becomes anti-system has a chance of winning those Americans who are both on the left and on the right. And that's a huge opportunity for Democrats in 2026 and 2028 because they have the benefit of being the opposition party, not the incumbent, which is naturally uh, an anti-system position for them. Whether or not they take this advice and try to compete in the anti-systemness of American politics is obviously up to party leadership. And there are some other incentives working among party leadership that might hamper their ability to do so. Most party leaders, for example, are not so anti-system, to put it mildly. And it's not obvious that they can capture this very potent component of ideology that Trump has road to victory. But these anti-system voters have traditionally voted for far left candidates in American politics as well. Among
Mm,
Democrats, being anti-system was the best predictor of whether or not you were a supporter of Bernie Sanders, for example, in
mm.
2016. So it might be very potent in 2028 as well.
Okay, let's move a little bit sort of into the current affairs space. You've mentioned the war, obviously. You've written also a lot about sort of hot button issues, Iran, AI, immigration, economy, affordability, ICE deportations. We've already touched on a couple of these things. Which of these hot button issues has proved the most important for voters over the first 15-ish months of Trump's presidency, maybe second to the economy and affordability, since that's usually number one, but maybe I'm wrong.
So after affordability, which
Yeah,
issue is most potent?
yeah. Since I assume affordability is number one.
American politics is almost exclusively or primarily about conditions when you really get down to it.
Mm,
Uh, so it's not just that prices at the grocery store or housing are expensive. It's also that healthcare prices are expensive. So depending on whether or not you count that as another issue, my response would be healthcare. But
mm,
abstracting from anything having to do with money, the foreign entanglements of the administration have been a very uh, severe drawback for the president. Um, he won younger voters, for example, primarily off of a promise to end spending on foreign wars and spend it on domestic infrastructure and lowering prices here at home, also a bit of an affordability issue. Um, so there's been a lot of foreign entanglements over the last 15 months or so, or 13 months or so. Um, in Venezuela was the latest big example of Trump breaking his promise on this. Of course, now there's an even bigger story and a potential, actually maybe as of this morning, boots on the ground situation and potentially in Iran. Um, and that would be a much more significant, uh, what do we call it, own goal in football. So I think that would be, I think that's my number two pick for something that's most significant because it weakens the appeal of Trumpism so fundamentally.
Yeah.
Uh, I probably should have said tariffs as well, but I'm
Mm.
thinking of that as primarily an affordability issue. Of course, Donald Trump also ran on restoring manufacturing jobs, and his tariffs have cost about 100,000 manufacturing jobs, according to the government statistics. So it's also a pretty bad situation to be in if you're Donald Trump.
It's not a great number. It doesn't, not a
Yeah.
great look. Um, you said obviously Iran is still like a developing story. It's hard to extrapolate right now what exactly the impact of the war is going to be on the presidency, but I think we can probably safely say not good. You've also written a bit about this sort of lack of rally around the flag behavior that we've seen, which is in contrast with other wars like Iraq and Afghanistan, and the dislike that political independents and soft partisans in particular have shown towards the war. Can you talk a little bit about why this is important and how it might shape people's voting behavior in the next few months, if this is really going to have an impact?
Well, voters view the war in Iran not just as a betrayal of Trumpism, but it's also a very deep trigger in the American psyche these days of failed policy from previous administrations.
Mm.
Um, yeah, we can talk about the polls here, of course. So Donald Trump's approval rating is lower now, as you know, this morning than it has ever been before, including in his first term after January 6th. Um, Americans say, I believe 60% of them or more, that the war is a bad use of taxpayer dollars, that it puts Americans in harm, actually makes Americans at home less safe. But the big problem here is not about the numbers, it's about the politics of it all.
Mm.
Uh, the war in Iraq is viewed as a political failure here at home, for example, as a quagmire. The term "forever war" is thrown around, but but is still very potent. Um, and of course, the impact on the prices of gas is also going to be very triggering to Americans, to use maybe my Generation Z terminology. And I think all of this combined is like a bundle issue of a lot of disparate anxieties Americans have that uh, one unpopular war speaks to all of those anxieties, reminds Americans of those underlying anxieties about foreign entanglements, price shocks, our position in the world on the world stage, um, and all of that reflects poorly on the commander in chief, our effective head of state.
Right. So a lot of things coming together and sort of reflected in this one issue.
That's right.
Um, this is sort of a question for our European listeners who are always curious about the effects that issues like this will have on NATO. Trump has obviously lashed out at NATO and NATO allies for not getting involved in the war and has called into question the US's commitment to the alliance as he likes to do every couple of months. So can you tell us a little bit about what the polling shows about regular Americans' feelings about or support for NATO and how maybe it breaks down by demographic group if there are those numbers?
Yeah, well, Americans broadly support a role for U.S. in NATO, and they approve of NATO, regardless of whether or not America is part of that. Perhaps there's some latent, well, certainly some latent Cold War um, mentality, even among younger Americans, in regards to how we feel about Russia. Um, so polls like Gallup and Pew routinely find Americans support NATO, 65% of it, and they disapprove of the US threatening to withdraw or decreasing its funding. Um, there's a predictable partisan split here. So Democrats strongly support NATO membership. Independents who decide elections mainly strongly support NATO membership, and MAGA Republicans are very skeptical. Maybe they will change their tune after this new war. That'll be an opportunity for us to look at the data again. Um, but there's also a resonance with Donald Trump when he says, falsely, I think, from our shared understanding here, that other countries have abandoned their commitments to NATO. Americans are very susceptible to arguments about fairness and doing the right amount of work and pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. And I think that maps onto this as well. But the real risk to NATO, of course, isn't public opinion. We're not going to be able to shape administrative action or the administration's actions on NATO. It's executives and whether or not they will defer on their commitments when the time comes. So that is an obvious source of stress for the international community, and not confined only to NATO. Treaties about solving global climate change, for example, are also deeply tenuous. There's really no comfort here. I don't know how else to say that.
That's okay. I think we're in a space where we can be honest with each other. I will do, I think, two, maybe three more questions, and then I think we have a lot of good audience questions coming in, so we will move to those. I will ask another hot button topic is immigration. Everyone loves to talk about it. You have advocated for Democrats to be more aggressive on this issue, which has come to be considered one of their weakest in the last decade or so. Can you explain why you've taken this stance and why you feel the numbers back you up on it?
Yeah, well, I might spin, maybe I'm putting a spin on myself, but my position on all matters of politics is to follow the data. That may seem obvious to an audience that is very empirical, but is not always the case in Washington, where ideology and relationships also matter. So I have found myself on somewhat of progressive turf here, or liberal, depending on your persuasion, turf here. But it's from a desire to get the numbers right rather than ideological. So the argument at the beginning of Donald Trump's administration was that immigration was a toxic issue for the Democrats. Trump won in this historiography the 2024 election because of his position on immigration and border security. And Democrats shouldn't talk about those things because Donald Trump just won on them. A fair enough calculation. But the counter arguments, I think, are very powerful here. The first one being that public opinion is not static. It can move over time, and it is, in fact, mostly moved, not organically evolving, but led a certain direction by partisan opinion leaders and opinion elites in the country. Um, and that and second, that what the Trump administration was doing was a severe overreach compared to what they had promised. So Donald Trump promised deportations for criminals mainly. They would use terminology like mass deportations, but the popular understanding of the actual policy that they would implement was about deporting criminals, mass deportations of criminals. In their mind, every undocumented immigrant is a criminal. And we've seen the consequences of that overreach. So treating most undocumented immigrants who have been here for decades and work in their local community and are visible and they go to church, et cetera, treating those people the same as people who came across the border yesterday or have committed violent crimes has been viewed very unpopularly by the American public since before Donald Trump even won the 2024 election. If you're doing the math on this, then there's an obvious path for Democrats to gain back some ground on the immigration issue. Yes, the one that they had struggled with the most in 2024. And that path led through pointing out the executive overreach, a harsh treatment of people who had been here for a very long time. And as the polls showed, 70% of Americans also thought the administration was focusing too much political capital on immigration. And those 3 points, I think I've actually been the data has borne, I think, this argument that Democrats should push on this correct over the last 2 or 3 months, as the consequences of the overreach have turned tragic in places like Minneapolis and Los Angeles.
Yeah. Follow the data. I think I will do one more question and then we'll move into audience questions. But this is a question that we also often get from our European friends on protests. Why people aren't out on the street all the time protesting against Trump and his actions. You actually very conveniently wrote a story about the increase in protests and Trump backlash showing up in real life in February. So can you tell us a little bit about what the hard data says about protesting and how backlash to Trump is showing up in real life on the streets, et cetera?
Yeah, when you told me you were going to ask this, I had been reflecting on this, and my first thought was, well, they have been protesting at a much higher rate, Americans, than they had been in the recent past. There's been more protests with more individuals protesting than there were in Donald Trump's first term. And that is a testament, I think, to the reaction to the executive overreach and also some good branding decisions on the part of the protesters. No kings. It's a very American message and resonates with a president who has called himself a dictator. So they have been, I think, is part of the answer, but it doesn't look like they have been. The US is huge, is one problem here.
Yeah.
So even with 2,000 protests, for example, which are scheduled this weekend, it could even be more for the next No Kings protest. You know, what's 2,000 protests in a country of, I don't even know how many towns, right? But tens of thousands.
Right.
And if you can get 10 million voters out, which would be the largest single day protest in American history, I don't know how that compares to European numbers, but would certainly be quite large by European standards. That's still only 3% of the US population, or under 3%. Right. So there's what we call a base rate problem in the statistics. There's just so many of us. You could get a lot of people out, but it doesn't seem that significant in electoral terms. And then part of the problem is just the American attitude towards getting out and protesting, and physical political activity is viewed as extreme. That things have to be, I guess, Occupy Wall Street level for you to get out there and participate politically. Whereas in my anecdotal experience, I used to work in Europe. Well, perhaps continental Europe, may not consider a British magazine Europe anymore. But my interpretation is that the political activity there is viewed as less of an interruption in daily life, whereas Americans are very concerned with their conditions in their daily lives outside of politics, and view that sort of activity as extreme and are unlikely to do so unless they're really moved by something around them. There's a bit of a social contagion effect, however, that might be operating with the recent backlash to Trump. So I actually expect the protest activity to get worse or more intense as the midterms get closer. People are paying more attention, and this is viewed as the thing that you do when a president is unpopular and overreaching his mandates.
Right. So it overcomes the perception problem of protesting being extreme a little bit.
That's a better way to put it. Yeah. Yes.
All right, so we have a bunch of questions. I will start in on them. The first one is about polling methodology, which is great because I was going to ask a similar question. So we have an audience member asking, where does the data come from and how is it gathered, especially the poll results? Who is asked? How many people are asked? How does it represent different groups, Hispanic people, women, etc.? Is it online?
The survey data that I have cited in my report is from a variety of sources. Polls that are conducted online, in which a person such as myself might go to a website, yougov.com, and sign up to take surveys that are sent to me through some algorithm that the company has determined that I'm a good candidate to take this survey. Or in America, we have lists of registered voters and their phone numbers, and you can purchase these lists from the states or from companies. We call them voter file companies that aggregate all that data, and then you can text people or call them. And that provides, if people are actually pick up the phone, which is another problem pollsters face these days,
Yeah.
a semi-random sample of those numbers or these people in online panels produces representative data within some amount of error, right? I mean, the polls have taken a beating in the last couple of elections here, 2016 and 2024 being the big ones, but 2020 was the polls were also actually the polls were worse in 2020. We just don't
Mm,
think about it because the right, the leader in the survey still won. But
yeah.
even then, the surveys are only off by 2 percentage points. So we're getting a pretty accurate read on public opinion. The way that pollsters ensure demographic groups are represented is to sample a certain number of them in every survey. Or, so if you're saying 70% of the sample should be white, you're interviewing 1,000 people, you interview 700 white people. Or pollsters they have some statistical tricks up their sleeve and they can adjust the data that they get to be representative by demographic group. This is called weighting in the literature, not to get too wonky here.
We love in the weeds. All right. Our second question is about the culture wars. So how potent a vote determining issue are the culture wars in the face of a weak economy and foreign wars? For which demographic regional groups are they most deterministic?
A sociologist named Ron Inglehart is famous for producing this theory that when your material condition, only when your material conditions are satisfied, are you freed up to think about politics as social, cultural warfare. Maybe that's right on average. There are, of course, portions of America, many Americans whose material conditions are not met and yet are incredibly swayed by social arguments. So
Mm-hmm.
maybe, to use the social science terminology, there is an error term with Mr. Inglehart's theory. But on average, in terms of setting up the context of political conflict, I think he's right. And we've seen in the last 5 years or so in Biden's presidency and Donald Trump's an increasing focus on material conditions instead of the culture war and that has been led by Americans and also led somewhat by the press, which likes to focus on numbers. And we have lots of economic statistics here from the government. So it's easy to focus on the economic numbers. And when gas prices go up, we have really good data on gas prices. So the news media can make good charts, which is, of course, my MO as well. And so it's easy to focus on the economic conflict. And I expect economic concerns to weigh more on voters in 2026 than they had in 2018. For example, when the backlash to Donald Trump was more about immigration policy, there was a policy of
Mm.
separating families at the border when they crossed from the US Mexico border, for example. That was very unpopular. And a general reaction to Donald Trump, the man, right, the figure, and his baggage as a person whereas most of this backlash now is about him not breaking his promises on prices and the war, executive overreach on immigration. And when you ask voters who were formerly Donald Trump voters who are no longer what their main issues are, it's those three issues plus in fourth place, voters will say they don't like him as a person. He's toxic as a person. Um, Social issues do still matter to a lot of voters, especially if you are part of a minority who is in the social issue groups.
Mm-hmm.
But for the last couple of years, they have been secondary to most political conflict.
All right. We have two sort of specific uh, questions. One, a few months ago, Democrats said they would concentrate on 18 constituencies they might be able to flip. Is this still a number that's valid? Or are they still focusing on those 18 constituencies?
I don't know what this refers to. 18 districts, sorry. And
Yeah.
when I'm thinking constituency, right, I'm thinking groups of voters. But yes, there are, so I don't know the 18 that are being talked about. There are about 20 seats that Democrats would win today if the polls were exactly right. If Democrats won by 6% in the popular vote in the House, they would flip around 20 seats. You know, depending on candidates and fundraising and such. If Democrats win by 10 points, then they're looking at flipping 30 or 35 seats, which would be a significant majority in the chamber, certainly more than in 2018. And the Democrats may even flip seats without having to do anything because of redistricting. The seats that are most up for grabs are those where Hispanics are overrepresented. There's been a large shift against the president because of affordability and other issues among Hispanics. Suburban and urban voters are overrepresented. I mentioned earlier to you these rural voters are dropping off, but those seats are largely uncontested, whereas suburban seats are very marginal. And affordability concerns also appear to be heightened in the suburbs. I think 18 or 20 is roughly the right number. Yeah.
My colleague tells me the commenter is probably referring to the red to blue program from the DCCC, but I think you answered the question well. Another question, how are you assessing the potential impact of the strong independent Senate campaigns in Nebraska and Montana? And are there any others to watch out for?
I am on the record, and I will be on the record again now, as saying Democrats should stop trying to win in ruby red seats. Not, not your Ohio's. Those were very recently blue, but your Kansases, your Nebraskas, your Wyomings, because the brand is so toxic there that it becomes almost impossible to convince a Donald Trump voter to even give you a shot. It's almost impossible to even get your foot in the door. Whereas an independent has no baggage of party affiliation either way. In this context, the right-leaning independent, for example, there is now one in the US House, I believe, or at least calls themselves an independent, has no baggage of being associated with Donald Trump, which is great right now. And independent running in Nebraska, so Dan Osborne, if he picks pro-worker policies, has no baggage of having to be a Democrat who supports pro-worker policies. I think this is, what the party should do. The Democrats should probably stand down as other parties do tactically in other democracies and let independent parties or third parties run there that have a better shot of, in this case, the Democrats' big priority is not necessarily winning, but preventing the Republicans from winning. And so having independents in those seats is tactically smart, and they have a really good shot. The independent candidate in Nebraska, Dan Osborne, lost, I believe, by 4 or 5 points in 2024, whereas Donald Trump won that state by 25, 30 points. So it makes a huge difference. and it is very smart for the party to think more tactically about where they should compete.
Yeah. Um, this is a tough question, but maybe you have a great answer that I haven't thought of yet.
I'll do my best.
Especially given Donald Trump's falling approval ratings. You obviously write a lot about presidential approval ratings. Will the fairness and integrity of the midterms be upheld? Will Donald Trump accept the results?
Maybe, maybe. Well, I hate to be too wishy-washy about this. It seems obvious. I'm putting on my political science hat here that Donald Trump will contest the results of the election after the fact if he loses,
Mm,
and that he will try to disrupt the process of the 2026 elections however he can,
hmm
whether that be sending ICE officers to polling locations, which has been floated and defended by members close to the administration, or pursuing the current bill called the Save America Act, the joint voter ID and voter purging. And the bill also establishes pretty onerous bureaucratic requirements on the people who do voter registration in America, the local secretaries of states and election officials. See, it seems like that this law, if it passes, also gives the administration a lot of latitude to punish blue states and target those onerous requirements to blue state election officials, which would also disrupt the election. And finally, polling closures, a polling
hmm
place where Americans have to cast their ballots. Uh, the closures of those locations are up to the discretion in many states of Republican leaning electoral boards, which are not independent in America and staffed by partisans in many cases. And I imagine we saw one example of this in Texas recently, where the local polling places in Dallas were moved, and Americans were confused about where they had to go to vote on election day, and that hurt turnout among certain groups. You can imagine in a blowout election, none of this matters, but elections in America can be very close. In a close Senate race, for example, in Georgia, that could be decisive if no one in
hmm
Atlanta knows where to vote.
Right.
So there's a big question on the fairness, and it, I would be shocked if Donald Trump, the day after the election, said this was a legitimate election.
Yeah. Lots to look forward to.
Sure. Yeah.
You covered the next question a bit with your last answer, sort of about other election manipulation other than redistricting. But the second part of the question is, do you think Republicans are going to succeed in federalizing state elections in the longer term?
Yeah, the Constitution is still very clear that the states have authority over state elections. And in fact, the previous controversy in the Supreme Court was over whether or not states should have more power, the state legislature in particular, over federal elections, whether or not the Constitution was almost contradictory on this question. Um, I can see a world where the Supreme Court, which is now staffed by partisan Republicans who are sometimes textualists and sometimes originalists who seem to interpret the law in many cases based on political expediency. I could see a case where that separation is degraded and the federal government has more control. But first off, it's not something that I have expertise in. But second, it seems almost up to the pressures that the administration is putting on those
Hmm.
members of the court. It's almost besides the point. However, whether or not the control is at the state or the federal level, and this is because parties are the most important divider in American politics today, not whether or not you're federal or state, the federalism. And this is the biggest blind spot in the American Constitution is the failure uh, to to see that parties could overcome the devolution of powers or federalism in powers. So if you have partisan Republicans at all levels of the federal government, for that matter, partisan Democrats in an imagined future, pushing for laws that make elections less fair or harder to vote, etc. It doesn't really matter what level they're at.
Got it. Okay, we have the last audience question. It has disappeared. Let me find it. Where do you see the role of Congress after the midterms?
Is it that general?
It is.
um, I I see Congress doing more oversight if Democrats win. They will have full
Mm,
authority to subpoena members of the administration, both former and current, which they will use, perhaps abuse. I imagine there will be high profile hearings every day, as there were
hmm
in after 2018 as well. And in their defense, that is Congress's responsibility per Article 1 of the Constitution. And there are plenty of examples of executive overreach for them to interrogate. Um, you know, if there are if branches of Congress are split, so Democrats control the House and Republicans control the Senate, or even if Democrats control both houses and Donald Trump is still president, there will be basically no scope for legislation
Yeah.
anyway. And so we should expect a lot of this non-legislative activity
hmm
in Congress. Yeah, I think you'll see a lot of oversight hearings if that's what the question is about. And for putting on my partisan cap here, maybe I think there also should have been more of those so far. So we'll see.
hmm I have a closing question, and then we will let you go on your merry way. Are there any surprising or under the radar trends or stories that we should be watching that you think are going to be particularly influential for the midterms?
Yeah, the big thing to watch, I'm giving you a bit of a cop out answer here. The big thing to watch is whether or not Donald Trump can turn out those members of his coalition that typically do not turn out in midterm elections. I don't think it will matter at the end of the day. There are enough people who have actually changed their mind to overcome any turnout effects. But this is clearly what the Republican Party, the Republican National Convention, is trying to do. They are, I believe, have scheduled or maybe still rumored to be scheduled a party convention after Labor Day to try to increase turnout among what we call low propensity or low turnout Republican voters, so that the party faces less of an inherent disadvantage in the midterm year. And I don't think that they will be successful at this, but that is probably the biggest remaining wild card. Of course, there could be black swan events, which are potentially worth worrying about given the current war and potential economic fallout or likely economic fallout, worth paying attention to, but at least on the electoral side of things. The big question I have is, can he get these low turnout voters actually to come to the polls?
That's a good way to end it. So, want to say thank you so much, Elliott, for joining us today, for writing this great publication, which I want to remind everyone is on our website and linked in the chat. This live stream will be viewable on YouTube later if anyone who is watching wants to share it with people who missed it. And feel free to follow us on social media, follow Elliott on social media for more such events and updates on our work here. So thank you again, Elliott, for joining us. Thank you to the audience for joining us and for some really excellent questions. And I hope everyone has a lovely Thursday afternoon or evening, wherever you're watching from.
Thank you.